Last night, something unfolded in a way no one in the room could have anticipated, and the atmosphere shifted so quietly that it felt almost heavier than sound itself. What began as a normal gathering of familiar voices and relaxed conversation changed when one person suddenly went silent, lowering their gaze as if carrying thoughts they had avoided for far too long. The shift did not go unnoticed, as those nearby immediately picked up on the subtle changes in expression, the pause in breath, and the tension that suggested an internal struggle. A gentle question broke the silence, but the response did not come easily, as though words were stuck somewhere between hesitation and truth. Around them, the room seemed to grow smaller in feeling, every background sound fading as an unspoken truth pressed closer to the surface. It was clear they had been holding something back for a long time, carefully hiding it beneath composure, routine, and quiet self-denial. But restraint eventually breaks, and in that moment, the weight of everything unspoken finally began to surface. With a quiet breath, they admitted they were ready to say what had long been left unsaid, changing everything in the room. That single moment marked a turning point no one could ignore, as understanding slowly settled in, and the unspoken history behind their silence finally began to reveal itself in fragments of emotion and realization for everyone present in that shared moment together now. They leaned back, exhaled slowly, and for a second it looked as though they might stop speaking again. But this time they continued, because once truth begins, it refuses to return to silence. They admitted that every distraction had failed, every attempt to move forward had left them circling back to the same memory. Every conversation with someone else eventually became empty, because deep inside, one name kept returning: your presence, your energy, your absence, all of it. They said they had tried to convince themselves that time would erase it, but time only made it clearer. Their closest friend looked stunned, because this was the first time they had spoken with complete honesty. Until last night, they had always acted certain, always appeared in control, always answered questions with half-truths and unfinished explanations. But last night, there was no performance left. They confessed that some nights had become longer than expected, because thoughts they never planned to revisit kept arriving without warning. Certain words you once said had returned in exact detail. Certain moments they thought were forgotten had become impossible to ignore. They admitted that even ordinary things had started reminding them of what they once felt, but never fully acknowledged. And then one friend asked the question that changed everything again: "So why are you saying it now?" The answer came slowly: because something shifted recently, because silence no longer felt safe, because pretending had become heavier than admitting the truth, because they realized that some feelings do not disappear simply because they are delayed, do not skip, because this is where everything became deeper than anyone expected. They explained that lately they had been noticing how often your memory returned during unexpected moments, during ordinary hours, during quiet evenings, during conversations that had nothing to do with you. It happened without warning, and every time it happened, it brought the same uncomfortable realization: what they had buried was still alive. One friend tried to interrupt, but your person continued, almost as if afraid they would lose courage if they stopped. They admitted they had watched others move easily through life, while they remained emotionally unfinished inside. They admitted that some part of them had stayed connected to something unresolved, something they had never clearly named until now. And then came the sentence that left everyone silent again. They said they were afraid that by the time they understood what was true, the moment to say it might already be gone. That sentence changed the mood completely, because now this was no longer just a confession, it was regret beginning to speak. Stay till the end, because something huge is waiting for you, and this next part carries a weight that even they were not prepared to reveal. One friend asked whether they had ever truly let go. The answer was immediate this time. No hesitation, no confusion, just one honest word. And that one word said more than every previous silence combined. They admitted that they had hidden behind distance, because admitting attachment felt risky. They convinced themselves that if they remained quiet, emotions would fade naturally. But instead of fading, everything became sharper with time. They remembered conversations they never expected to remember. Small details no one else would understand. The way certain moments stayed bright while other memories disappeared. It unsettled them, because it proved that some connections leave marks deeper than pride can erase. Then they admitted something else, something they had not planned to say. They said there were times they almost reached out, times they almost broke their own silence, times they opened a message and stared without sending anything. Their friends looked at each other, because this was the first sign that what they felt had remained active far longer than anyone knew. Do not skip. The deeper truth had still not arrived, because after saying all this, they became quiet again, then finally admitted what had truly been sitting underneath everything. They were no longer certain whether hiding their feelings had protected them or cost them something important. That sentence stayed in the room like a weight. No one answered immediately, because everyone understood that once someone reaches that realization, something inside them has already begun to change. And perhaps that is why last night mattered more than any night before. What unfolded last night went beyond a simple confession. It marked the quiet beginning of emotional honesty after a long stretch of avoidance, where feelings had been carefully buried rather than expressed. In a small, tense moment between friends, someone finally asked a question that cut through the hesitation. If everything were on the table right now, what would you actually say? The response came with a distant look and a faint, conflicted smile that seemed to hold both regret and relief. The answer was simple, almost fragile, that the truth should have been spoken much earlier, and for a moment, nothing else was said. The silence that followed was no longer empty, it carried understanding, as if something unspoken had finally surfaced and settled in the room. Yet what happened next surprised everyone present, because instead of closing the conversation, it opened a deeper layer. The person continued, speaking with a kind of raw honesty that appears only when pride is no longer being protected. They admitted that for a long time they had tried to rationalize their emotions, shaping explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, but never reflected what was truly happening inside. In reality, no matter how much they tried to move forward mentally, something unresolved kept pulling them back to the same emotional place. When asked whether this feeling had grown stronger recently, they hesitated, as if searching for words that would not betray what they felt. They took a breath, paused, and then nodded in a way that said more than words could. That small gesture made everyone in the room realize this was not a passing thought. This was something that had been building quietly for longer than anyone knew. Do not skip, because what they revealed next changed the entire conversation. They admitted there had been nights when they suddenly remembered details they thought were long gone, specific words, certain expressions, quiet moments that seemed ordinary at the time but now felt impossible to forget. It surprised even them, because they had not invited those memories back. They arrived on their own, as if something inside refused to let the connection disappear completely. Then one friend asked carefully, "Did you ever tell yourself it was over?" Your person gave a faint smile, but it was the kind of smile people show when they know they had been pretending. They said yes, many times. They had told themselves it was finished. They had told themselves enough time had passed. They had told themselves silence meant closure. But every time they believed that, something small happened that broke the illusion again. A familiar thought, a random memory, a feeling they could not explain, and suddenly everything they claimed was over felt unfinished again. Stay till the end, because something huge is waiting for you, and the next sentence surprised even their closest friends. They admitted that recently they had started noticing how often they compared ordinary moments to something they once felt but never fully understood until now. They said they had met people, spoken to others, filled time with distractions, but none of it carried the same quiet impact. That confession changed the room, because now this was no longer about memory, it was about realization. One friend asked the question everyone was thinking, "So are you saying you never stopped feeling something?" Your person looked directly ahead and answered softly, "Maybe I stopped saying it, but I never stopped carrying it." That sentence left everyone silent again, because those words were too honest to ignore. Do not skip. This next moment is where everything became impossible to deny. A friend who had listened quietly until then finally asked why they had hidden this for so long, if the feeling was still there. The answer came slower this time, almost like each word had to be pulled carefully from somewhere deep. They said sometimes people hide truth because saying it out loud makes it real, and once it becomes real, you must face what you delayed, what you misunderstood, and what you may have almost lost by staying silent too long. That answer made even the strongest voice in the room go quiet, because everyone understood that your person was no longer speaking casually. They were speaking from a place they had avoided for a very long time. Then came another unexpected confession. They admitted that there were moments recently when they almost reached out, almost broke their silence, almost chose honesty, but every time they stopped themselves because they did not know whether the timing still belonged to them. Stay till the end, because something huge is waiting for you. And what they admitted after that carried even more weight. They said the hardest part was realizing that feelings can remain quiet without disappearing. They do not always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they wait patiently until one night arrives when hiding them becomes harder than admitting them. And last night became that night. One friend asked whether they believed this feeling still mattered now. Your person answered with something no one expected. If it did not matter, I would not still be thinking about what should have been said. That sentence stayed in the room like an echo, because regret does not speak unless something valuable still exists in memory. Do not skip, because this is where their voice changed again. They admitted there was one thing they had never told anyone, not even their closest friends. There were times when they imagined what would happen if honesty arrived too late. Times when they wondered whether silence had already changed more than they understood. Times when they questioned whether missing the right moment had become the one thing they could not correct. And for the first time, their friends saw not hesitation, but sincerity without defense. No performance, no careful wording, just truth. Something huge is waiting for you, because what happened next revealed that even your person did not expect how deeply this confession would affect them. One friend asked softly, "What if you still had a chance?" This time your person did not answer quickly. In that moment, everything seemed to slow as they lowered their gaze and let out a controlled breath before speaking, finally admitting, in their own way, that they were done pretending. There was nothing left to confess, and that single line quietly shifted the entire weight of the room. What had once felt like a discussion about past events suddenly turned into something far more uncertain, as if the focus had moved from what already happened to what still could unfold, and everyone present instinctively felt that they were standing at the edge of a turning point. The silence that followed was not empty, but charged, because it marked the first time a buried feeling was no longer being avoided, but acknowledged without escape. Even those who thought they understood the situation were caught off guard when the person at the center of it all stopped retreating into hesitation and instead chose complete honesty, almost surprising themselves in the process. When a friend finally gathered the courage to ask what no one else had dared to voice, questioning what had triggered this sudden confession after so long, there was a pause, heavy enough to be felt rather than heard. Their posture remained still, eyes lowered, as though searching within for a way to translate something deeply personal into words that would not feel too exposed. Eventually, they revealed that earlier that day, a small, almost ordinary moment had surfaced unexpectedly, something brief and easily overlooked by others, but powerful enough to undo the silence they had carefully maintained, bringing back emotions they believed had already been put to rest and quietly reshaping everything once again. They admitted that the reminder felt stronger than expected because it arrived at the exact moment they were pretending they had already moved on. And that contradiction shook them, because when someone believes they are finished with a feeling, but one ordinary second can still change their entire mood, it means something inside was never truly finished. Their friends listened more carefully now, because every sentence coming from your person sounded less like memory and more like realization unfolding in real time. Then one friend asked softly, "Have you been carrying this every day?" Your person answered in a way no one expected. "Not every day," they said, "but often enough that I can no longer call it accidental." That answer made the room completely still, because there is a difference between remembering someone once and quietly realizing they still return to your thoughts more often than they should. Stay till the end, because something huge is waiting for you, and what they confessed next made even their closest friend lose words. They admitted that there were moments when they laughed with others while part of their mind drifted elsewhere, moments when conversations continued around them, but internally they were comparing feelings, comparing energy, comparing what felt genuine and what felt incomplete. They said this had become difficult to ignore because the comparison always led back to one place they had never fully closed. Then they revealed something they had hidden even deeper. There were nights when they almost spoke honestly to themselves, but stopped because honesty would force them to admit that distance had never fully changed what remained inside. Do not skip, because this is where their voice became even more serious. One friend finally asked, "Are you afraid of what this means?" Your person answered immediately this time, "Yes, because once I admit this fully, I cannot pretend anymore." That sentence carried weight because everyone understood exactly what it meant. Pretending had become their protection, distance had become their excuse, silence had become their shield. But last night, all three began to break. Something huge is waiting for you, because the next revelation came without warning. They admitted there had been moments when they heard others speak confidently about what they should do, who they should forget, how they should move on. But none of that advice reached the part of them still holding unanswered feelings, because advice can guide actions, but it cannot erase what remains emotionally unfinished. Their friend leaned forward and asked one final question. If everything became honest right now, what would be hardest to admit? This time your person did not hesitate. They said the hardest truth was realizing they had spent too long acting unaffected while secretly hoping clarity would arrive on its own. But clarity did not arrive quietly. It arrived last night. It arrived in that room. It arrived when they heard themselves say words they had avoided for so long. Stay till the end, because what happened after that became the most unforgettable part of the night. A friend who had barely spoken until then looked directly at your person and said, "Then maybe what you feel has been real for much longer than you allowed yourself to admit." No one interrupted after that, because suddenly the truth felt visible to everyone, and your person did not deny it. Instead, they gave a slow breath and admitted something even deeper. Maybe I knew before tonight. I just did not want to hear myself say it. That sentence landed with extraordinary force, because hearing truth from your own voice changes everything. Do not skip. The final moment of that night revealed the clearest sign yet. Before the conversation ended, your person looked at their friends and quietly said that if life gave them one honest moment again, they would choose different words than before. Not delayed words, not guarded words, different words. And everyone understood that this was no longer just reflection. It was the beginning of inner change. Because sometimes the strongest confession is not loud. It is the quiet sentence that finally arrives after too much silence. And last night, that sentence finally arrived. What followed that moment was something no one in the room had expected. Because even after the earlier confessions, there was still a sense that everything important had already been revealed. Yet silence proved otherwise. The atmosphere shifted into something deeper, almost still, as if the space itself was waiting for a truth that had been held back for too long. The person at the center of it all seemed distant for a few seconds, not absent, but inwardly pulled into thoughts they had avoided confronting for a long time. And when they finally lifted their gaze, there was a noticeable change in their expression, softer yet far more certain. It was the kind of look that appears when denial finally runs out of room to exist. A friend, sensing the shift, asked gently if there was still something left unsaid, and that simple question seemed to unlock what had been sealed away. There was no rush in the response that followed, only a careful honesty forming in real time. They admitted that the real struggle was never about recognizing the feeling itself, but about accepting how persistently it had stayed alive, despite every attempt to ignore it. They explained that opportunities for honesty had come before, but each time they were pushed aside through silence, distraction, or delay, because speaking it aloud would have meant acknowledging how deeply one presence still lingered in their life. In that moment, everything reframed itself, and it became clear this was not a sudden realization, but something long understood and finally spoken. This had been quietly building behind ordinary days, hidden under routines, hidden under conversations, hidden even under laughter. Stay till the end, because something huge is waiting for you. And the next confession surprised everyone in the room. Your person admitted there were times they intentionally avoided certain conversations because they knew exactly where those conversations would lead. They knew one simple question from the right person could expose everything they had tried to keep hidden. And last night, that question finally arrived. One friend asked softly, "Do you think they would be surprised if they knew all this?" Your person looked down and answered with honesty that no longer carried defense. "Yes, because I never let them see how much stayed with me." That answer left everyone silent again, because now this was not only confession, it was realization mixed with regret. They explained that some people believe silence protects dignity, but silence can also hide feelings so deeply that even the person carrying them begins pretending they no longer exist, and that is exactly what happened. Until last night. Do not skip, because the next part revealed something even more unexpected. They admitted there were moments when they heard a name, saw something familiar, or passed through an ordinary hour that suddenly felt heavier than it should. And each time it happened, they understood that certain emotional connections do not disappear simply because life keeps moving. One friend asked, "So why now? Why tonight?" This time your person answered immediately, "Because tonight I got tired of hearing my own thoughts, and pretending they meant nothing. That sentence landed with unusual force, because honesty often begins when pretending becomes exhausting. Something huge is waiting for you, because the next truth came without hesitation. They admitted that if someone had asked them a month ago, they would have denied everything. A week ago, they would have changed the subject. Even yesterday morning, they might have laughed it off. But something inside shifted, and once it shifted, the truth became impossible to hold back. Stay till the end, because this next moment became the strongest part of the entire conversation. A friend then asked the one question no one had yet spoken clearly. If they were standing here right now, what would you finally admit? The room became still. Your person took a breath, and for the first time that night, their voice softened in a way that revealed everything words had not yet fully carried. They said they would admit that some people leave an impression that time cannot easily replace. They would admit that distance taught them many things, but it did not erase what remained meaningful. They would admit that some unfinished feelings become clearer only after enough silence has passed. And most importantly, they would admit that pretending to be unaffected had become harder than speaking honestly. That answer changed everything, because now even their own friends could see that what had once been hidden was no longer hidden at all. Do not skip. One final truth emerged before the night ended. Before anyone could respond, your person quietly added something almost no one expected. I think I waited too long to stop pretending I had already accepted everything. That sentence carried more emotion than any other that night. What followed felt like the kind of moment that only makes sense in hindsight, when people realize that the real weight of a conversation was never in the words spoken loudly, but in the pauses that kept stretching between them. Everyone in the room could sense that something had shifted long before anyone was ready to name it, as if the atmosphere itself had grown heavier with unspoken recognition. The discussion had already peeled back layers of carefully maintained composure, exposing emotions that had been stored away for far too long. Yet there remained an unmistakable feeling that the deepest truth was still waiting beneath the surface. Those watching could see it in subtle expressions, in the brief breaks in eye contact, in the way hesitation lingered just a second longer than comfort allowed. Then, without warning, the final admission arrived. Not dramatic, but steady, carrying the quiet force of someone no longer willing to soften what needed to be understood. They confessed that the most unsettling realization was not the presence of emotion itself, but the way they had mistaken avoidance for resolution, convincing themselves that staying silent meant moving on, when it had only preserved uncertainty in disguise. As those words settled into the space between them, the entire mood changed again, not with chaos but with a sudden clarity that made everything that came before feel like preparation for this single, unguarded truth. Because everyone understood, they were no longer describing a passing emotion. They were speaking about something that had survived every attempt to disappear. Do not skip, because what they confessed next became the strongest revelation of the entire night. One friend asked gently, "What finally made you certain?" Your person answered in a way that stunned even themselves. Because no matter how normal everything looked outside, something inside never became as distant as I claimed. The room went still again, not because the words were loud, but because they were impossible to misunderstand. They explained that there had been many ordinary days when nothing unusual happened. Yet even on those days, certain thoughts returned unexpectedly, small memories, unfinished conversations, moments they once ignored, but now understood differently. And the more they tried to dismiss it, the clearer it became. Stay till the end, because something huge is waiting for you, and the next sentence carried a weight no one expected. They admitted that sometimes the hardest truth is discovering that what you tried to leave behind never truly left you in the same way. One friend asked, Do you think this feeling changed while you were silent? Your person paused, then answered quietly, "No, I think silence only made me hear it more clearly." That answer stayed with everyone, because silence often reveals what noise once covered. Do not skip, because the final part of their confession was the most unforgettable. They admitted there were moments they almost reached complete honesty before, but fear always arrived first. Fear of saying too much, fear of sounding too late, fear of discovering that timing had changed while feelings had not. But last night, something inside became stronger than fear, and that is why they finally opened up. One friend then asked the question that ended the night in complete silence. If you had one chance to send only one honest sentence, what would it be? Your person did not think for long, because this answer had clearly existed inside them for longer than they admitted. They said, "Some truths refuse to stay hidden. Once you notice, they still carry weight long after silence tries to bury them." And that was exactly the feeling that settled over the room, as no one found the need to interrupt what had already become clear without explanation. In that stillness, the conversation shifted into something deeper, as if a boundary had been crossed and there was no way back to pretending otherwise. Before it ended, there was one final admission, quiet but heavy, acknowledging that the delay was never confusion but awareness, an understanding that honesty reshapes everything it touches and, once released, cannot be taken back or softened into comfort again. Speaking it aloud demands a kind of courage that cannot be postponed forever, and in that moment, it finally arrived without announcement. As the room prepared to return to ordinary life, a final thought lingered when they said they had spent too long acting as though acceptance had already happened, when in truth the heart was still catching up with reality. That simple realization stayed behind even after voices changed and the moment dissolved into memory. Because often, the most powerful confessions are not loud or dramatic, but quiet acknowledgments of something that has been true for a long time, waiting only for the person to stop resisting it. And that night, resistance finally ended in silence that said everything, and nothing felt the same afterward at all.